The snow crunched beneath my boots as I stepped off the chartered helicopter, the rotor blades still whipping the Arctic air into a frenzy above my head. Dr. Sarah Chen, my research partner, landed beside me with her equipment cases, her breath forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the bitter Canadian wind. "Are you certain this is the right coordinates?" she shouted over the dying engine noise. I checked my GPS device for the third time in 10 minutes. Positive. This should be exactly where Anjukuni Lake Village stood according to the 1930 records. But as we looked around, there was nothing. Absolutely nothing except endless white snow stretching toward the tree line in the distance. No remnants of foundations, no scattered debris, no indication that 2,000 people had ever lived here. My name is Dr. Marcus Webb, and I'm an anthropologist specializing in unexplained population disappearances. What brought me to this desolate spot in the Northwest Territories wasn't academic curiosity alone, it was the haunting testimony of Joe LaBelle, a fur trapper whose 1930 account had been buried in Royal Canadian Mounted Police files for nearly a century. The helicopter pilot, a weathered man named Bill Mackenzie, approached us as he secured his aircraft. "You folks sure you want to stay out here overnight? Weather's supposed to turn nasty, and I've got a bad feeling about this place." "We'll be fine," I assured him, though something in his expression made me uneasy. "You'll be back tomorrow at noon, right? Assuming the weather holds." He glanced around nervously. "My grandfather used to tell stories about this area. Said the old-timers called it the place where people go missing. Never paid much attention until now, standing here in person." As the helicopter disappeared into the gray sky, Sarah and I began setting up our camp. The silence was immediate and oppressive, no wind through trees, no animal sounds, just the soft whisper of falling snow that had begun while we worked. "Marcus, look at this," Sarah called from about 50 yards away. She was kneeling beside what appeared to be a slight depression in the snow. When I reached her, she had brushed away several inches of powder, revealing dark, frozen earth beneath. "This isn't natural permafrost," she said, pulling out her geological hammer. "The soil composition is different here. It's as if something burned at extremely high temperatures, then the ground was disturbed and refilled." I felt the first chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic air. According to Joe LaBelle's original report, when he arrived at Anjukuni Lake in November 1930, he found a thriving Inuit village completely abandoned. Not destroyed, not raided, simply empty, as if every single resident had vanished mid-task. LaBelle's account, which I had memorized from the RCMP files, described kayaks still tied to the shore, food cooking over cold fires, and rifles left behind, something no Inuit hunter would ever do voluntarily. Most disturbing were the sled dogs, found dead of starvation but still chained to their posts, suggesting the departure had been sudden and the people had expected to return quickly. "Sarah, we need to expand our search grid," I said, pulling out the metal detector I'd brought. "If LaBelle's account is accurate, there should be artifacts everywhere." For the next 3 hours, we methodically swept the area. The metal detector remained stubbornly silent until we reached the area closest to where the original shoreline would have been. Beep. 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 Sarah began digging while I held the detector steady. About 2 feet down, her shovel struck something metallic. We carefully excavated around it, revealing a corroded rifle .303 British Enfield, exactly the type that would have been traded to Inuit hunters in the 1920s. "There's something else here," Sarah said, her voice tight. She had uncovered what appeared to be personal belongings, a carved ivory comb, several metal fishing hooks, and most unsettling of all, a child's toy, a small wooden doll with intricate facial carvings. But it was what we found next that made my blood run cold. Scattered among the artifacts were fragments of bone. Not ancient remains weathered by decades of exposure, but bones that showed signs of extreme heat damage, the kind of burning that occurs at temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. "Marcus," Sarah whispered, holding up a piece of skull fragment. "Look at this scarring pattern. This isn't from a cremation fire. This is from something much hotter, much more intense." As evening approached and we retreated to our tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The sensation was so strong that I kept stepping outside to scan the tree line with my flashlight, but the beam revealed only empty snow and distant pines. Inside our tent, Sarah spread out the artifacts we'd collected on a waterproof tarp. In the LED lamplight, they seemed to tell a story of interrupted lives, people who had expected to return to their belongings within hours, not abandon them forever. I've been thinking about the official explanation, she said, photographing each item. The RCMP concluded the village had simply relocated, following game migration patterns. But these artifacts suggest otherwise. I pulled out Joe LaBelle's original statement, which I'd photocopied from the RCMP archives in Yellowknife. His words, written in the formal language of a 1930 police report, still carried an undertone of deep unease. Upon arriving at the village site, I observed numerous dwellings standing empty but undisturbed. Kayaks remained moored, weapons abandoned, cooking fires cold but recently used. The sled dogs were found deceased, having starved while still chained, suggesting the inhabitants expected a brief absence. Most disturbing was the complete absence of footprints leading away from the village in any direction, despite fresh snow that would have preserved such tracks for several days. Sarah, what if the official explanation was a cover-up? I said. What if something happened here that the government didn't want public? She looked up from her documentation. Like what? I don't know. But I've been researching similar disappearances, and there's a pattern. Small, isolated communities vanishing without trace, always in remote areas, always with minimal investigation. The wind had picked up outside our tent, creating an eerie whistling sound that seemed almost musical. But as I listened more carefully, I realized it wasn't just wind. There was something else, a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to come from the ground beneath us. Do you hear that? I asked Sarah. She paused her work and listened. It's probably just the wind through underground ice formations. This whole area is riddled with permafrost caves. But I wasn't convinced. The sound had a pattern to it, almost like machinery operating deep underground. I made a mental note to investigate further in the morning. As we prepared for sleep, Sarah shared something that made my skin crawl. I've been analyzing the bone fragments under the microscope, she said. The heat damage isn't consistent with any natural fire. The cellular structure suggests exposure to directed energy, something more like industrial furnace temperatures, but applied very quickly. You mean like a weapon? I don't know what I mean. But whatever caused this burning, it wasn't a campfire that got out of control. I lay awake for hours that night, listening to the strange humming beneath our tent and trying to make sense of what we'd discovered. The official record stated that the Anjukuni Lake village had been found empty, with no signs of violence or struggle. The RCMP had concluded the residents had simply moved to follow caribou herds, taking their most valuable possessions but leaving everything else behind. But our findings suggested something far more sinister. Around 3 a.m., I was startled awake by Sarah shaking my shoulder. Marcus, you need to see this, she whispered urgently. I followed her outside, where she pointed toward the northern horizon. In the distance, barely visible against the dark sky, was a faint glow, not the aurora borealis, which typically appeared green or blue, but a steady orange-red light that pulsed with mechanical regularity. How long has that been there? I asked. I noticed it about 20 minutes ago. It's getting brighter. We watched for nearly an hour as the light gradually intensified, and I began to make out what appeared to be structures silhouetted against the glow. Not trees or natural rock formations, but geometric shapes that suggested human construction. We're hiking toward that light first thing in the morning, I decided. Marcus, that's at least 10 miles away across rough terrain. If we get lost. We won't get lost. But we need to find out what's generating that light. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, with the wind carrying an acrid smell that reminded me of burnt metal. The mysterious glow had faded with sunrise, but I had taken compass bearings and marked the direction carefully on my GPS. After a quick breakfast, we packed day packs and began trekking north across the frozen landscape. The terrain was more challenging than it had appeared from our camp, hidden ice crevasses, dense stands of scrub pine, and areas where the snow had drifted into chest-deep banks. About 3 hours into our hike, we crested a low ridge and found ourselves looking down into a valley that shouldn't have existed according to our topographical maps. The depression was roughly circular, perhaps 2 miles across, and at its center stood the remains of what could only be described as an industrial complex. Even from a distance, it was clear the facility had been abandoned for decades. Rusted buildings, collapsed towers, and enormous concrete foundations stretched across the valley floor. But most shocking was the evidence of massive excavation, terraced pit mines that descended hundreds of feet into the earth. This isn't on any map, Sarah said, checking her survey documents. According to these, this valley doesn't exist. As we descended into the depression, details became clearer and more disturbing. The buildings weren't just abandoned, they had been deliberately destroyed. Walls were blown outward, as if from internal explosions. Heavy machinery lay scattered and twisted, covered by decades of snow and rust. But it was the bones that made us both stop walking. Scattered around the industrial complex were thousands of bone fragments, many showing the same heat damage we'd found at our original site. Human remains mixed with what appeared to be caribou and other Arctic animals, all bearing evidence of the same intense, directed burning. "My God," Sarah whispered. "How many people died here?" I was examining what remained of a large concrete structure when I found the answer. Mounted on a partially destroyed wall was a metal plaque, corroded but still readable. Northern Extraction Operations established 1928. Authorized personnel only. Dominion of Canada Department of Mines. Below the main text, in smaller letters that I had to brush clean to read. Experimental Mining Facility Project Arctic Furnace. "Sarah, come look at this," I called. This was a government mining operation. She joined me at the plaque, her face pale. 1928. That's just 2 years before the village disappeared. We spent the rest of the day exploring the facility, and what we discovered painted a horrifying picture. This hadn't been a conventional mining operation. The equipment we found, though damaged and weathered, appeared designed for extracting something from deep underground using methods that generated enormous heat. In what must have been the main operations building, we found scattered documents preserved in a rusted filing cabinet. Most were too damaged to read, but a few fragments were legible. Indigenous population proving resistant to relocation efforts. Recommend immediate implementation of contingency protocols. Testing of prototype extraction system successful, temperatures reaching 2,100 degrees Fahrenheit. Disposal of contaminated organic material complete as of November 15, 1930. The final fragment made my hands shake as I read it. Operation Arctic Furnace concluded. All evidence of facility to be removed. Official report will indicate natural population migration. No further investigation recommended. As the pieces fell into place, I felt sick. The Anjukuni Lake village hadn't vanished mysteriously, its residents had been murdered to cover up this secret mining operation. The extreme heat that had damaged the bones we'd found wasn't from some unknown weapon, but from industrial furnaces designed to dispose of evidence. "We need to get back to camp and call for help," I told Sarah. "This is a mass grave site." But as we prepared to leave the valley, Sarah made one more discovery that changed everything. In the deepest part of the excavation, she found a section where the pit walls had been fused into glass-like smoothness, as if exposed to temperatures far beyond anything achievable with 1930s technology. "Marcus, look at this," she called from the bottom of the pit. "This isn't from any mining equipment. These temperatures are impossible for that era." I climbed down to examine the fused rock walls. She was right, the smooth, almost mirror-like surface suggested heat levels that wouldn't become available in industrial applications until decades later. What were they really mining here? I wondered aloud. Sarah was scraping samples from the fused wall when her tool struck something metallic embedded in the rock. We spent an hour carefully chipping away the fused material to reveal what appeared to be a fragment of machinery, but not human machinery. The metal was unlike anything I'd ever seen, with properties that seemed to defy physical laws. Despite being buried for nearly a century, it showed no signs of corrosion. The surface had a subtle iridescence that shifted colors as we moved it, and most unsettling of all, it was warm to the touch despite the sub-zero temperatures. "We need to get this analyzed," Sarah said, carefully wrapping the fragment in protective material. As we climbed out of the excavation site, the wind began to pick up again, and I heard that same rhythmic humming from the night before. But now, standing at the source of the sound, I realized it was coming from deep within the earth, far below even the deepest mining shafts. "Something's still down there," I told Sarah. "Something that's been running for 90 years. We hurried back toward our camp as the weather began to deteriorate. Snow was falling heavily now, and the wind had become strong enough to make walking difficult. But about halfway back, Sarah suddenly stopped. "Marcus, look," she said, pointing back toward the industrial site. I turned to see that faint orange glow had returned, even though it was still daylight. The light was emanating from the deepest part of the excavation, pulsing with the same rhythm as the underground humming. "Whatever they were mining," I said, "I don't think they finished extracting it." We reached our camp just as Bill Mackenzie's helicopter appeared on the horizon. As he landed, I could see the concern on his face. "Weather's turning bad fast," he shouted over the rotor noise. "We need to leave now if we're going to make it back." As we loaded our equipment and samples, I made a decision that would haunt me for years to come. I didn't tell Bill about the industrial site or what we discovered there. Something deep in my gut warned me that sharing this information too freely could be dangerous. The flight back to Yellowknife was turbulent, with Bill fighting increasingly strong winds and snow. But even through the storm, I could see that orange glow in the distance behind us, now bright enough to be visible for miles. "What's that light back there?" Bill asked through the intercom. "Aurora borealis," I lied. "Unusual color variation due to atmospheric conditions." But I caught him looking at me in the mirror with suspicious eyes. He knew aurora when he saw it, and what we'd left behind wasn't natural. Back in Yellowknife, Sarah and I checked into a hotel and began documenting our findings. The artifacts we'd collected, the bone fragments, the photographs of the industrial site, and most importantly, that strange metallic fragment that continued to pulse with warmth, all of it pointed to a conspiracy that had lasted nearly a century. But as we worked late into the night, Sarah noticed something disturbing. "Marcus, the metal fragment is getting warmer," she said. "And look at this." She held up her electromagnetic field detector, which was registering readings far beyond normal background levels. The fragment wasn't just warm, it was actively generating some form of energy. "We need to get this to a proper laboratory," I decided. "The University of Toronto has equipment that can analyze this safely." But the next morning, our plans changed dramatically. Sarah woke me with a frantic phone call from her room. "Marcus, they took it," she said, her voice shaking. "Someone broke into my room last night and took the metal fragment. Nothing else is missing, just that." I checked my own room and found that while nothing had been taken, it was clear someone had searched through all my belongings with professional thoroughness. Our research notes were still there, but they had been photographed. I could tell because papers had been reordered slightly differently than how I'd left them. "We're being watched," I told Sarah. "Someone doesn't want us investigating this further." That afternoon, as we prepared to fly back to Toronto, Bill Mackenzie approached us at the airport with a worried expression. "Dr. Webb, I need to tell you something," he said quietly. "After I dropped you folks off yesterday, I got a visit from some government men. They wanted to know exactly where I'd taken you and what you'd found out there." "What did you tell them?" "Nothing specific, but they knew more about your research than they should have. They also warned me not to take any more flights to that area without proper authorization." As our commercial flight took off from Yellowknife, I looked down at the vast wilderness below and wondered how many other secrets were buried in that frozen landscape. The official story of the Anjukuni Lake Village disappearance had been accepted for 90 years, filed away as an unsolved mystery when it was actually a carefully covered-up atrocity. But what troubled me most was the realization that whatever had been discovered at that mining site was apparently still considered classified. The theft of our evidence, the professional search of our belongings, and the warnings given to Bill Mackenzie all suggested that Project Arctic Furnace hadn't ended in 1930, it had simply gone deeper underground. Back in Toronto, Sarah and I tried to continue our research using university resources, but we quickly ran into bureaucratic obstacles. Our requests for ground-penetrating radar surveys of the site were denied. Applications for archaeological permits were rejected without explanation. Even our academic colleagues began treating us with suspicion, as if they'd been warned to maintain distance. 3 weeks after our return, Sarah received a job offer from a private research foundation in Switzerland, an offer too generous to refuse, but one that required her to sign extensive non-disclosure agreements and relocate immediately. "They want me gone," she told me during our final meeting. "This opportunity is a bribe to keep me quiet about what we found." "Are you going to take it?" She looked at me with sad eyes. "I have to. My funding here has been mysteriously cut, and I've been informed that my position at the university won't be renewed. I have a career to think about." After Sarah left for Switzerland, I found myself increasingly isolated in my research. Graduate students who had worked with me for years suddenly requested transfers to other projects. Research grants I'd held for decades were not renewed. The message was clear: abandon this investigation or face professional exile. But I couldn't let it go. Using personal funds, I hired a private investigator to research the history of northern extraction operations. What he discovered was chilling. The company had been a shell corporation established by the Canadian government specifically for the Arctic Furnace project. After 1930, all records of the company had been systematically destroyed, and the 3 senior officials who had overseen the operation had all died within 2 years of the project's conclusion, officially from unrelated accidents and illnesses. The investigator also uncovered something else. Similar mining operations had been established in remote locations across northern Canada during the same time period, all using identical corporate structures and all shutting down abruptly in the early 1930s. Each site corresponded with documented disappearances of indigenous communities. It wasn't just one cover-up, it was a systematic program of extraction and elimination that had spanned the entire Arctic region. But the most disturbing discovery came when the investigator tried to research what specific material had been mined at these sites. Every geological survey from the era had been classified, and even modern satellite imagery of the areas was restricted under national security provisions. Whatever they were after, the investigator told me, the government still considers it a state secret 90 years later. As I sat in my office late one evening, reviewing all the evidence we'd gathered, I made a connection that changed my understanding of everything. The metallic fragment we'd found, with its impossible properties and energy generation, reminded me of materials described in classified military research I'd encountered years earlier during my work with defense contractors. What if Project Arctic Furnace hadn't been a mining operation at all? What if they'd been extracting something that had fallen from space, something that required those extreme temperatures to process, and something valuable enough to justify the murder of thousands of people? The more I researched, the more evidence I found supporting this theory. Meteorite impact sites across the Canadian Arctic from the 1920s, many in locations that later became restricted military zones. Unusual aurora activity reported during the same period. And most tellingly, the establishment of several secretive government research facilities in the years immediately following the Arctic furnace shutdowns. I began to believe that the Anjukuni Lake massacre hadn't been about covering up a mining operation, it had been about concealing humanity's first contact with extraterrestrial materials. But my investigation was about to take a darker turn. 2 months after Sarah's departure, I received an unexpected visitor at my university office. A man in his 70s, walking with a cane and introducing himself as Joseph LaBelle Jr. My father was the trapper who found the empty village, he told me. Before he died, he told me things that weren't in his official report. Things the police wouldn't let him say. Joe Jr. pulled out a worn leather journal and opened it to pages filled with his father's handwriting. Dad kept detailed notes of everything he saw at Anjukuni Lake. The official report only included the sanitized version the RCMP was willing to file. As I read the journal entries, my blood ran cold. Joe LaBelle Sr. had described finding not just an empty village, but evidence of a mass burning. Piles of ash that contained bone fragments. Scorch marks on the ground in perfect geometric patterns. And most disturbing of all, strange metallic debris scattered throughout the site that seemed to generate its own heat. The government men came to visit Dad twice after he filed his report, Joe Jr. continued. They made it clear that he was to forget about the metal objects and stick to the story about natural relocation. But Dad kept samples hidden away for decades. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small wrapped bundle. Inside was a fragment of the same impossible metal Sarah and I had found at the mining site, still warm, still showing that subtle iridescence. "I want you to have this," he said. Dad always believed the truth should come out eventually. As Joe Jr. left my office, I realized I now had physical evidence again. But I also knew that possessing it put me in danger. If someone had broken into Sarah's hotel room to steal our first sample, they would certainly be monitoring me for any new discoveries. That night, I made multiple copies of all our research and distributed them to colleagues around the world, with instructions to make the information public if anything happened to me. Then I secured the metal fragment in a safety deposit box and began planning my return to the Arctic. I had to see that industrial site again, but this time I would go alone and without official permits. Whatever secrets were buried in that frozen valley, I was determined to uncover them completely. It took me 3 months to arrange everything. Using contacts in the private aviation industry, I chartered a helicopter flight under false pretenses. I told the pilot I was conducting wildlife surveys and needed to be dropped off for a week-long camping expedition. When I returned to the valley containing the industrial ruins, I found that it had changed dramatically. Where before there had been obvious abandonment and decay, now there were signs of recent activity. New access roads had been carved into the permafrost. Modern equipment was stationed around the perimeter. And most shocking of all, the excavation pit had been expanded and was now filled with sophisticated drilling apparatus. Someone had resumed operations at the site. I spent 2 days observing from a concealed position on the valley rim, documenting everything with a telephoto camera. The workers below appeared to be conducting some form of deep extraction operation, using technology far more advanced than anything available in the 1930s. But on my third night of surveillance, I was discovered. I woke to the sound of approaching snowmobiles and barely had time to grab my camera and research notes before armed men in Arctic camouflage surrounded my camp. They wore no identifying patches or badges, but their equipment and coordination marked them as military personnel. Dr. Webb, their leader said, somehow knowing my identity despite my false travel documents. "You're trespassing on restricted government property." "I'm conducting legitimate archaeological research," I replied. "No, Dr. Webb. You're interfering with an ongoing national security operation. One that's been classified since 1930 and will remain classified for the foreseeable future." They confiscated all my equipment and research materials, then escorted me to a waiting helicopter. During the flight, the team leader provided me with what he called clarification of the situation. The Anjukuni Lake incident was a necessary action to protect a discovery of unprecedented importance, he explained. The indigenous population had begun showing signs of exposure to materials that posed a threat to national security. Relocation efforts failed, and containment became the only option. "You mean murder became the only option?" "I mean that sometimes governments must make difficult decisions to protect larger populations. The technology we extracted from this site has contributed to advances in energy production, materials science, and defense applications that have benefited all of humanity. At the cost of thousands of lives. At the cost of maintaining the stability of modern civilization. Dr. Webb, what we found here in 1928 changed our understanding of physics, chemistry, and humanity's place in the universe. But public knowledge of these discoveries would have caused social chaos, religious upheaval, and international conflicts that could have destroyed our species." As we flew south toward Yellowknife, I realized that the cover-up hadn't been about hiding a simple military operation, it had been about concealing a discovery so significant that it was deemed too dangerous for public knowledge. But the conversation wasn't over. "However," the team leader continued, "your investigation has been noted by people in very high positions. People who believe that perhaps the time for secrecy is coming to an end." He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written across it in official government letterhead. "Inside you'll find an offer, Dr. Webb. A chance to learn the complete truth about what happened at Anjukuni Lake, and about dozens of similar operations conducted around the world over the past century. In exchange, you'll be asked to help develop protocols for gradually releasing this information to the public in a way that won't cause societal collapse." I stared at the envelope, knowing that opening it would change my life forever. "What if I refuse?" "Then you'll return to your university position, your research funding will be mysteriously restored, and you'll never again be able to get within 100 miles of any of these sites. You'll spend the rest of your career knowing that the greatest discovery in human history exists just beyond your reach." When we landed in Yellowknife, I was given a hotel room and told I had 24 hours to decide. The envelope remained unopened on the desk as I struggled with the implications of either choice. If I accepted their offer, I would become part of the conspiracy that had covered up mass murder for nearly a century. But I would also gain access to knowledge that could fundamentally change human understanding of our place in the universe. If I refused, thousands of victims would remain forgotten, their deaths officially non-existent, while whatever had been discovered in the Arctic continued to be exploited in secret. The next morning, I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an address in Ottawa and a date 2 weeks in the future. Below that was a handwritten note, "Dr. Webb, the choice to reveal the truth has already been made at the highest levels of government. The only remaining question is whether you'll help us do it responsibly. Director, Special Advisory Committee on Anomalous Materials." I flew back to Toronto in a daze, knowing that my life as an independent researcher was over. But I also knew that the truth about Anjukuni Lake, about Project Arctic Furnace, and about humanity's first contact with technologies beyond our understanding was finally going to emerge. The vanishing town hadn't vanished at all, it had been erased to protect a secret that governments around the world had deemed too dangerous for human knowledge. But after 90 years of lies, that secret was about to be revealed. As I write this account, I'm preparing to travel to Ottawa for that meeting. I don't know what I'll learn there, or what role I'll be asked to play in the disclosure process. But I do know that the families of those who died at Anjukuni Lake deserve to have their truth told. The empty village Joe LaBelle found in 1930 wasn't empty because its people had moved away. It was empty because they had been eliminated to hide the greatest discovery in human history, a discovery that's still buried in the frozen ground of the Canadian Arctic, still generating that mysterious glow, still humming with energy after nearly a century. And soon, the world will know what was worth killing 2,000 innocent people to keep secret. The truth is finally coming to light. But I fear that when it does, we'll understand why it was hidden for so long. Some knowledge, once revealed, can never be contained again.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like and subscribe button, and then share it with your friends. Your support helps us grow and create even more awesome content. We appreciate you being part of the journey.